I'm sure IronNet would buy cable.
Yes. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I guess I should grab the microphone. Hey. It's working. All right. Hey, thank you all for coming. My name is Jamil Jaffer. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute here at George Mason University's Anderson Scalia Law School. I'm very excited today to be bringing this event to you here. NSI is in partnership with INSA. INSA is the leading nonpartisan nonprofit trade association driving public-private partnerships to advance intelligence and national security priorities. INSA has more than 160 corporate members and enjoys extensive participation from senior leaders in the intelligence and national security communities. INSA has long been a partner. They partner with us on our Distinguished Speaker Series here at the law school. And we're honored to have with us the COO of INSA, Suzanne Wilson-Heckenberg. Suzanne was named INSA's first COO in May 2016 after serving as VP of Development since 2012. She's had a long career, including as a VP of Marketing for Ripple Communications, and began her career as a whip assistant to Congressman Newt Gingrich. So Suzanne, come on up. Thank you so much, and she'll introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Jamil. As Jamil said, I'm with the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. We are a nonprofit that's been around for now 40 years. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. We bring together the public, private, and academic sectors within the intelligence and national security community to solve some of the tough challenges, policy challenges that the community is facing. One thing I wanted to mention to you is INSA has a graduate student intern program. From time to time, we do have law school students participate in our internship program, which runs for about 12 to 18 months. We have one of our graduate school interns with us today, Megan, who is at Marymount University. She'd be happy to answer any questions about the organization or the opportunities we have after our remarks this afternoon. But we're thrilled to have this partnership with NSI. We've co-hosted several events over the past couple of years, and are delighted that Jamil has invited us to partner on today's event. As you all know, Jamil is the assistant professor of law and the director of NSI. He's also the vice president for strategy and partnership at IronNet Cybersecurity. He was the chief counsel and senior advisor for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he is also was the senior counsel to the House Permanent Select Committee. He is a proud grad of UCLA for undergrad, and he received his law degree from the University of Chicago Law School. We're also happy to have Brent McIntosh with us today. He's the general counsel for the Department of Treasury. Mr. McIntosh serves as the head of the Treasury's legal division. Prior to Treasury, Brent spent, I think, about 8 years at the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, and he was also at the White House from 2006 to 2009. He served as the Associate General Counsel to the President and as Deputy Assistant to the President. His work is focused on national security and intelligence matters, as well as the judicial selection process. He earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Michigan and his law degree from Yale Law School. We're excited to have both of these folks here with us today, and I'll turn it over to Jamil.
Thanks so much, Suzanne, and join me in welcoming our special guest, Brent McIntosh. I had to do that because Brent actually was previously my boss at the Justice Department in the Office of Legal Policy.
Talk about hardship duty.
Yeah, exactly. So we thought we'd sort of have just a casual conversation about Brent's work at Treasury, so you guys can sort of get a sense of what he does and what his day-to-day is like, and then we'll open it up for questions to the audience. Does that work for you, Brent?
That's great. That
awesome.
Good.
So look, Brent, typically the Treasury Department's been focused on banks, financial institutions, regulation of those entities, but increasingly we've seen Treasury get involved in national security issues, terrorism, money laundering, trade issues with some of our key trading partners. Sanctions has become an increasing tool in national security. Why is Treasury such a big player in the national security realm all of a sudden?
Yeah, fair question. I should, first of all, thank you for hosting me. It's a delight to be here. I've been a fan and watched the evolution of the NSI since it was founded, and I'm delighted to be here and grateful to be sitting here with you, my old friend and twice colleague at PJ and at the White House. So Treasury, why is Treasury involved in these foreign policy issues? People think of Treasury in terms of the inflow of money and the collection of taxes and the outflow of money in paying the government's debts, and also the borrowing of money in the issuance of United States government debt. But over the course of the past about 20 years, Treasury has become increasingly involved in a variety of national security issues and foreign policy issues. And that really has ramped up pretty dramatically, as you know, after 9/11, because there have been a series of foreign policy challenges and national security challenges that are particularly susceptible to and involved with the economy and the financial system. And so those are some of the things you mentioned. One of them is that Treasury administers a good deal of the United States' sanctions programs around the world, whether it's counterterrorism sanctions, whether it's country-specific sanctions, Russia, North Korea, Venezuela in the news these days. And those sanctions are primarily administered, although there are some that are immigration-based or otherwise. A lot of those sanctions are actually administered through the economic system and more directly through the financial system, and by cutting individuals off from the U.S. financial system. Another of the things that became increasingly prominent as a role for Treasury in the national security system in the post-9/11 era is the investigation of financial flows around the world for nefarious purposes. The obvious one of those is cutting off terrorist financing, but there are others as well. We spend a good deal of time working on things like corruption and other illicit finance, and so that function is one that has really become of increasing prominence for us in the post-9/11 world because it's one that's specifically suited to use of the financial system for national security purposes. And then you have things like that have been around for a long time, but that have taken on increased prominence with the integration of the global economy, like our investment security regime, known CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which Treasury chairs, although it's an interagency body that has members from 11 different agencies, but is fundamentally a question of how particular transactions and acquisitions of U.S. companies will affect the national security. And that, as we all know, has been an increasingly important part of the evaluation of the effects of the economy on national security. And we were both in the administration during Dubai Ports World, and so saw the impact of that on how we think about it. We've all tried to forget about it.
You tell people a little bit about what
Dubai Ports World was a transaction, a CFIUS transaction, where an entity from the Middle East acquired rights in a U.S. port, and it was approved relatively routinely through the committee, and then it became kind of a cause célèbre in the press and on the Hill, and there was a big postmortem about how this got through, and it led to legislation that reformed the CFIUS investment security process, which was the first major reform of that process since CFIUS was created in 1975 under President Ford. And then the most recent reform of that process was actually last year in the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA, passed last year, which was really the most thoroughgoing reform of that system that has ever been undertaken.
And we'll get more to CFIUS later, but just to give people a preview, so CFIUS is a method by which the U.S. government looks at foreign investors who want to purchase a U.S. corporation, or foreign entities that want to buy a U.S. corporation, and looks at whether there are national security issues in that transaction, and if there are, either prohibits it or puts in place certain provisions to protect the national security interests. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So to drill down a bit, what happens is if you're a foreign acquirer or a U.S. business, and you are doing a transaction that might touch somehow the national security. So say you're a foreign acquirer, and you've decided to buy a U.S. tech company that sells goods to the Department of Defense. In that case,
which happens more often.
Happens. You need to file with the committee to notify them of the transaction. And the committee then will do two things. It will look at whether the transaction is one that is subject to the jurisdiction of the committee. will it result in foreign control of a U.S. company? And second, they'll assess the national security effects of that transaction. Does it have outstanding national security effects for the United States? And people think of this as sort of an up-down determination. Let the transaction go through, which is the default, because we are open to investment in the United States. We believe deeply in foreign investment in the United States. Or turn the transaction down, block the transaction, which requires actually presidential action. Really, it's a little more nuanced than that, because in a number of instances, companies will come to the committee and say, look, we know you're going to have concerns about this transaction, and there are ways to mitigate those concerns. There are ways to ensure that the national security harm that you perceive is one that we can prevent from happening, whether it's by ensuring that sensitive data is not transferred to the foreign acquirer, putting in place a U.S. person board, things like that. So we often work out mitigation agreements to mitigate potential national security harms. So it's not really just an approve or a block decision.
And what's the role of your office, the General Counsel's office, in, well, we'll come to cities. These things more generally, the sanctions regime, right, the stuff that we do against Iran or North Korea, China, Russia, to the extent we have cyber sanctions, with respect to China, I guess we haven't implemented any of those, but we might, right? There's some talk of that. What is the General Counsel's role in these national security actions that you might see Treasury taking?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. It's for those who are potential lawyers, there's a real divide between among career paths for lawyers, between people who are law firm people.
Which you were for a while.
I was for a while, and being a general counsel, which is fundamentally quite different. The challenge, you're much more integrated with the enterprise. You're much more a part of the ongoing decision making day to day. You're really at the table. It's not, call up the lawyers and ask a question and they come back to us in a week. It's much more, we're working through these problems on a real-time basis. You're at the table, so.
And your job is to get the mission done.
Yeah, exactly. And so, there's the real goal for a general counsel is to make sure that you're complying with all the laws while accomplishing the mission of the agency. And it's very easy. I was listening to a podcast about this that the ABA put on this morning. It's very easy to just, as a general counsel, to say no. And that's the sort of...
And even easier as outside counsel.
Yeah. But it's much harder as a general counsel. The role of a general counsel is to say, the way you're doing this is problematic, but here's a way to achieve your goal that is perfectly consistent with the governing law. And so we're a part of the day-to-day operation to sit with the folks who are making these judgments, whether it's Insifious attempting to determine coverage, which really fundamentally is a legal question, it's a jurisdictional question, or whether it's in sanctions to look at our authorities and say, here's what we can do, and here's what's not within our authorities. So it really is a part of the ongoing mission.
And is your role just to say, this is where the legal boundaries are, and they stop here, and you can do this much? Or do you also have a sort of policy advising role and say, look, you've got this much room to run the law, and here's where you ought to be, right? You ought to be right up to the line, or just short of the line. I mean, you play, does it go beyond just a purely like, here's what the law lets you do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a debate that general counsels have. I mean, you and I have seen people have that question internally to themselves. Am I a person who just, I'll tell you where the law is, and I'm not going to give that sort of advice? I think a general counsel owes client advice not just on exactly where the law is, but what the repercussions of being close to the line or far from the line are. I really think it's an important part.
So it's not just close lines. I think most people say, look, the role of the general counsel is to say, well, here's the line, and then if you get close, you might have this danger.
Yeah.
But there is a danger in being too far back off the line, too, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, and so that's right. There's a danger from being too far back of the line, both in the sense that then you've established a precedent that you're not willing to go near the edge of your legal authorities. But there's also a danger there's a danger that if you are too cautious as a lawyer, for example, you gain a reputation for not being a person who's willing to who's someone that the policy folks want to consult. And you never want to.
So you get cut out of the process.
You want to be the person who's in the process and saying, here's what the line is. Here's what's here are the dangers of being this close to the line, the dangers of being this close to the line. Here are the dangers of being over the line. Don't go over the line because of X or Y. But you want to articulate. You have, for example, if we get this close to the line, I think the likelihood is that there will be litigation risk, for example. And it may be that ultimately our position is vindicated. But it will mean that for some period of time we'll have uncertainty because of litigation risk.
Yeah.
And that's a judgment call that policymakers are entitled to make, but it's one that you need to fill them in on. You need to, when you advise clients as a general counsel, you need to be willing to say, look, in this space we have uncertainty as to the legality. In this space we have complete certainty as to legality. And the consequences of uncertainty are X, Y, and Z, whether it's litigation risk or risk of congressional oversight or things like that. So there's a risk assessment aspect as well as a legality assessment.
So let's talk about one area where I think there's a lot of both legal issues of getting close to the line and far from the line, but also some policy issues about where that line is, and that's the sanctions regime, right? Sanctions have become increasingly the primary tool of U.S. foreign policy. We don't, we less often today do we sort of sail aircraft carriers into the Taiwan Straits, much less deploy troops overseas, although we have a lot of troops deployed around the world in combat. I think we as a nation over the last, at least 12 years have been more reticent, both because of Afghanistan and Iraq, but just because the country's been less willing. What is the role of sanctions in national security policy? What's your office's role? How do you see it? Do you see it the way I described it? Is it true that sanctions is it now this critical tool, and should it be as important tool?
So, I think there's an important evolution in our sanctions tool that some people have commented on. There was a time when sanctions meant you pick a country and you don't trade with that country. That's what
you just shut them up.
Sanctions fundamentally meant. If you look at the way our sanctions are done now, they are nuanced and calibrated, and they can be dialed up and they can be dialed down. So if you look at, for example, pick a country. We can pick individuals within the country and say, look, this person is engaged in bad acts, and we can dial sanctions up against an individual or against an entity or against a group of individuals, and we're in a position where we can do really three different things with the sanctions. We can stigmatize bad actors, we can starve bad actors of the resources necessary to engage in the acts that they're undertaking, and we can, in many cases, coerce changes in behavior. And that, one of the underappreciated aspects of coercing changes in behavior is it's not just coercing changes in behavior from bad actors, which is clearly a part of our sanctions regime, and you see it happening, in particular if you see if you follow this closely, and in particular, if you follow the actions of individuals, you see changes in behavior. But it also it changes behavior of people who are deciding with whom to ally themselves or what actions to undertake, because you see people who don't want to take action X because they don't want to be. They don't want to be the next sanctioned individual. They don't want to be the next sanctioned entity. So it has three very different but complementary functions. And there's been a real change in the way we handle sanctions since 9/11. And many of the actors in this space who turned the sanctions regime into something much more robust and tailored, and people call it smart sanctions. It really is. It's a very different sanctions regime than it was 20 years ago.
So, without getting into specific details about any specific individual or set of companies, there has been some sort of criticism directed at Treasury where you successfully use sanctions to change people's behavior. You got them to divest assets and the like, but the criticism has been, well, these are still bad people. Why are you letting them off? Even though, I think probably from Treasury's perspective, you sought a change of behavior, you sought divestment, it happened, and then you got a raft of criticism. How do you deal with that sort of scenario? Is it sort of just an unwinnable game? You sort of set a goal, you apply the sanctions, you meet the goal, you then remove the sanctions, and you're still criticized because, you know, and by the way, I was one of the critics, to be fair. So what do you do in that kind of scenario?
I mean,
Is that an unfair criticism, by the way?
well, so we see criticisms on both sides of any of these actions because there are some subset of people who think, or any time when we coerce a change in behavior. So, for example, we separate a bad actor from
The company.
ownership or control of his company, and then we de-designate the company because he no longer owns or controls it.
Even though the person remains designated because they're a bad actor.
And the person remains designated because they're a bad actor. We get some amount of, there are some people who think we ought to keep the dial higher and keep the companies designated until an even lower threshold for ownership or control is met. On the other hand, you have, people on the other side who are saying, you're being too aggressive with your sanctions regime. There clearly are international actors who think that we are too aggressive with
The
our
Europeans.
sanctions regime. I won't name any names. But so, look, the best we can do is
French.
make a good faith effort to use sanctions to coerce the behavior we want to coerce, and when we
Right.
see the results of that behavior, take the actions that we believe are appropriate in light of changes in behavior.
Right, that makes sense. What about what are the sort of hot? You mentioned Venezuela, right? That's a hot sanctions area right now, and so we've obviously got a interim president we've recognized, Juan Guaido, right? We've got what the U.S. believes is the usurper, Maduro, in power, sort of falling on Hugo Chavez. So we're sort of trying to starve Maduro of resources at the same time. Obviously, Venezuelan people are suffering, in part because of their leadership. We're trying to take food in. How do you deal with that sort of piece of the sanctions regime, which is, that at some level the sanctions regime has an impact on the average person, and when your humanitarian can't get in, they're still going to suffer. How does Treasury think about that sort of area and deal with that challenge of sanctions?
Yeah, I don't want to talk about any specific
Sure,
sanctions,
fair.
but let me say there are a few things we think about in this space. First of all, when you think about what portion of this is to the point we were discussing earlier about sanctioning the entire country versus sanctioning, for example, particular industries.
Yeah.
There are some industries that are going to have very substantial effects on the welfare of the populace, and there are some that are largely designed to allow
The rich to get richer.
the kleptocrats to get more kleptocratic. And we're much more likely to go after the latter than the former. Similarly, even those sanctions regimes that are broader, we routinely grant licenses for humanitarian aid.
I think that's a little known fact. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And so there are lots of places where we work very carefully to ensure that we are mitigating the harm of the sanctions regime to the populace. Now, the truth is, there are always going to be kleptocrats who want to, regardless of what measures we take to mitigate the harm to the populace and focus the harm on the powerful, there are always going to be those who attempt to impose that harm on their people because it benefits them.
Oh, so you think there are times in which you've calibrated the sanctions, you've calibrated sanctions in a way that's designed to help the people, but then the people in power actually levy the...
It's impossible to control kleptocrats' desire to change these, to impoverish, to benefit themselves, even if it impoverishes their people. But look, we work hard at not affecting the populace to the extent we can.
And so that, that is an interesting point, because I don't think a lot of people know that. It's really not covered in the media, right? Like the idea, you take the Iran sanctions, right? If the way that sort of the story is played out popularly, right, is that we're starving the Iranian people, right? And we're not letting anything in because we want to starve the regime, and we're really punishing the wrong people. How can the General Counsel and sort of the folks at Treasury that implement the sanctions, how can you tell that story better to sort of educate people about this sort of what you just laid out?
I'm not the public affairs.
Yeah.
I do my job, and we make it very clear, and I think it's clearer in countries actually, except in places where there's a propaganda effort
Right.
from the regime to distort that.
What about, so we talked about CFIUS a little bit earlier, right? And, there's been a lot of heat and light recently, particularly as the legislation you talked about, FIRMA, was going into effect about this idea that the Chinese investors are trying to invest in American companies to steal intellectual property or to get a competitive advantage when it comes to technology. How do you see, putting aside sort of China as a specific example, talking more generally, how do you see CFIUS's role in national security? You mentioned earlier that's what they're there to do. And what is Treasury's role specifically in the CFIUS process? You mentioned they chair the committee, but what does that mean?
Yes, so we chair the committee in the sense that we're the secretary is the chairman of the committee to the extent there is actually a set of people who are the committee.
Yeah.
But then we run the centralized staffing of the committee, so we coordinate the work of the committee.
Right.
Because of, this is frankly a recognition of the secretary's role, statutory role as the primary economic advisor to the president.
And you guys, and actually, Treasury just became a member of the National Security Council.
That's
right?
correct. Under in 2017, under CATSA, the Countering America's Advocates, or I can never remember what these.
The Russia sanctions.
The Russia sanctions bill. The secretary became the statutory member of the National Security Council. Traditionally, the secretary had been invited to sit at the National Security Council, but hadn't been a statutory member. The secretary is now a statutory member, which really makes sense given the role that Treasury plays in national security these days. But with regard to CFIUS in particular, we're the coordinating body, and so we have a CFIUS staff. We have a deputy assistant secretary who runs it, an assistant secretary to reports, and that effort is we receive the filings, we distribute them among the agency, we run that process, and attempt to play honest broker among agencies, as this is a big deal if you're the coordinator of one of these committees. And ultimately we do a lot of the negotiation with outside parties that are seeking approval. We have a lot of interaction with the Hill on CFIUS issues as well.
And why is that? What is
Well, so I mean, the Hill is always interested. Because of the Hill is always interested in because of the balance between the desire for an open investment regime to which the United States is very committed, and the desire to ensure that open investment regime does not have harmful effects on our national security. And so we worked very carefully over the course of the past year and a half to get legislation modernizing the CFIUS process, which recognized that the CFIUS process really, although it was functioning well, had places where it could be reformed to make the committee process more effective. So, there were, for example, over time we had come to realize that parties had realized how to structure around certain of CFIUS's jurisdictions.
So to not be brought in.
To not be brought in. Additionally, there were some things that that CFIUS didn't really touch because there were situations where the harm to the national security was not fundamentally from control over the organization, it was because of certain access that substantial ownership in the corporation gave. So, for example, some sensitive technology, if you could, in theory, get all the national security harm you wanted to impose by simply having access to that technology, even if you didn't control the U.S. corporation.
Right.
Similarly, there are U.S. companies that hold lots of data of U.S. persons. So, for example, if you had a company that held data on, for example, everyone in the armed forces, that would be very substantial, sensitive data. We don't want that sold to a foreign acquirer, and so. But that was a thing where we really needed additional authority to be able
to get involved.
To get involved.
And since we have a crowd of a lot of law students, what's the role of the lawyers in the CFIUS process? Like, what does your office do when it comes to CFIUS transactions?
So we spend a lot. First of all, it's funny because it's actually it's one of the government roles where you actually could be a transactional lawyer in a sense, because we have people who are negotiating contracts with enforceable contracts with these companies.
To do what?
To mitigate the harm often, and to say, okay, you're going to do this transaction, but we're going to sign a mitigation agreement that requires, for example, that your sensitive personal data on U.S. persons is not shared with or stored in a foreign country or something like that. So,
And how do you enforce that? How do you enforce those agreements?
Yeah, so one of the great things about the recent CFIUS legislation is it actually gives us an increased ability to put in place a staff that is focused on enforcement.
You didn't have that before?
We followed it, but it's a much more robust and well-resourced proposition now to follow those mitigation agreements and make sure that they are actually enforced and carried into effect.
And can you take people to court if they don't
Yeah, you
like
could,
that?
yeah.
Here in the United States?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's also the sort of blocking and tackling lawyering that you do in any agency process. Here it's focused on, do we have jurisdiction? Is this a transaction that will give rise to foreign ownership of a U.S. person? People who are going to be transactional lawyers, particularly M&A lawyers, there are a million different ways to structure a transaction. And so we routinely come across new structures where we think, does this or does this not give rise to CFIUS jurisdiction, give rise to foreign control over the U.S. company? And we spend a lot of time interacting with the parties in a sort of due diligence process to say, what are the rights of a foreign acquirer? What are they going to be? You're going to have ownership at this level. You're going to have veto power over this or that. So we spend a lot of time working through the structure of the transaction. And there's a very skilled CFIUS bar out there in the private sector that works with us and understands what we're looking for and is good at getting it to us.
Yeah, in fact, we actually just started offering this semester a class in what we call corporate national security law, which is essentially all the stuff you were just talking about: export controls, sanctions, CFIUS and the like, taught by a couple of members of the CFIUS bar.
We didn't have classes like that yet.
Well, you had classes at Yale? They taught you law?
Law and philosophy,
yeah,
law and
psychology.
sociology.
So I do want to talk. I do want to leave some time for the audience to ask questions, because I can ask questions for the whole time. But I do want to get into a couple of areas before we go to the audience questions. And one is sort of this combination of money laundering, but in particular about money laundering. I'm interested to know about cryptocurrencies. Right? Everyone's people talking less about Bitcoin today than they were maybe 6 months or a year ago. Maybe in part because of sort of actions the U.S. government has taken. But what sort of Treasury's take on cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin and the potential use of those cryptocurrencies to trade in illicit goods and to launder money and to be used for all sorts of nefarious purposes?
We're opposed to those uses.
Fair. So you don't like bad uses?
Yeah, we don't like the bad uses.
Right.
No, but, it's a fair question. I used to get this question a lot more when Bitcoin was at 19,000.
Right.
I get a little less now. But to assess the question of what we think about cryptocurrencies, you have to step back a little bit and say, what do we think about financial regulation? And the administration has put out a set of core principles regarding financial regulation that have to do with American competitiveness, consumer choice, and things like that. And so
Anti-regulation.
Ish. Modernizing regulation and having regulation be tailored to the purposes for which it is.
So more limited and focused, perhaps.
Focused and tailored and modernized. So when you look at cryptocurrencies and the technologies behind them, and it's important to distinguish those two things, if there is a beneficial use case that comes out of this space, then we should want American companies to be in the lead on that beneficial use case. If there is a beneficial use case, for example, for distributed ledger technology, blockchain, we should want American companies to be in the lead there. On the other hand, crypto is not a synonym for immune from the rule of law, and there are.
Some people want it to be.
That's true. Although look, we see there's a scale here, a spectrum of actors who think that the set of regulations that are in place for non-crypto. There are actors who think the entire point of crypto is to avoid the regulations, the AML and CFT regulations and things like that are in place for non-crypto. There are
AML, anti-money laundering.
Anti-money laundering,
and CFT.
Countering the financing of terrorism.
Okay. So there are folks who want to finance terrorism, and who want to launder money.
Yeah,
Right.
But look, there are also actors in this space who are responsible actors and recognize that if they're going to gain a place in the constellation of U.S. financials, U.S. financial services, that the United States government is going to enforce its money laundering rules, its know your customer or KYC rules. And so, for example, if you sign on to some of these wallets, you have a lot more, you have to provide a lot more information than you did 2 years ago, because they're taking, some of them are taking their know your customer obligations quite seriously. And so,
in fact, one of our professors here is the chief strategy officer for a Bitcoin company that I think operates in that space and sort of has that philosophy about it.
Yeah, and so you see differing views from the crypto anarchists to those who want to be part of the legitimate economy, but see real technological innovation.
But Bert, what about those people who and I think you sort of refer to them as maybe as crypto anarchists, but aside the people who want to finance terrorism and the people who want to launder money because they're bad people, what about sort of the libertarians? You know, we're at Scalia Law School where there is sort of a libertarian ethic. People just think the government should not be in the business of finding where my money goes. My money, I like cash in my mattress. I want crypto because I want to be able to do transactions with the cash in my mattress. Why should you be able to follow that money? You can't do it with cash. Why can't I?
Would say is using distributed ledger technology is not a particularly good way to hide where your transactions are, because all it does is hide who the transactions are. The
makes everything public.
The transactions are beautifully tracked on the ledger. But it's a fair question. I mean, the answer is we've made a societal commitment to combat money laundering. We've made a societal commitment to countering the financing of terrorism. We believe that when you have capital gains on an asset, you ought to pay taxes on it. And there,
maybe not so many taxes though.
Yeah, you ought to pay an appropriate level of taxes on it, which is, we could talk about tax reform at some other time. But we believe we have made a commitment which is fundamentally reflected in laws passed by a representative Congress and signed by the President of the United States over decades to certain principles. And so for example, some of those principles are: we oppose using these whatever mechanism, whether it's a barter system or a cryptocurrency, for money laundering. We oppose for example, if you look at what the SEC and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, are doing in this space, we oppose defrauding people using cryptocurrencies and defrauding investors. And so, they are, the view is, if there are beneficial use cases to come out of cryptocurrency and the technologies behind it, great, let's embrace those. But the idea that it is a lawless space where money laundering and securities fraud are going to get off scot-free, that's not our attitude.
All right, so that's fair, but I think there are those who would say, and I want to turn, after this question, I want to turn it over to the audience. There are those who say that, okay, fine, we get it. You've got to combat terrorist financing, you've got to combat money laundering, but the set of regulations, even in a fairly deregulatory or fairly limited regulatory sort of regime under this White House, it's still the case that between Treasury and SEC and CFTC, the fact that you're even out there getting interested in regulation is dampening investment in this economy, in this area of the economy, and as a result, and that investment has to go somewhere, so it's going overseas to China and Europe and wherever else, and as a result, we're not seeing the development of technology here in the U.S. where people think it ought to be. What about that concern?
When you talk about that, if you look at this, there are a huge number of these companies that are actually headquartered in the United States, and some of them quite leading companies in this space. So I think as an empirical matter, that's not correct. There will always be some people who want to avoid the rule of law, and that's a lot easier to do in some places outside the United States than it is to do in the United States. But so I don't really think that that's I don't think that, to the extent people are taking their operations outside the United States because they don't need to comply with, for example, consumer protection rules or with our prohibitions on money laundering, that's not activity we should be encouraging.
Great. Questions from the audience? We have mics in the ceiling, so just feel free to put your hand up and I'll call on you. If there are no questions, I have plenty. Yes, back there. Then I'll come to you, sir.
you just talk a little bit about what the day-to-day job of like an anti-money laundering lawyer in the Treasury Department is?
Yeah, so I'm not one, but I can.
You can play one on TV?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth actually backing up for people who are not in this space to talk about what our anti-money laundering system actually looks like, because that's not, I think, clear to people. There are a variety of things that we, by regulation, have defined as suspicious activity. And those, when a financial institution gets a transaction that hits one of those triggers, whether it's doing business that's with a sanctioned person or something like that, they file
a lot of cash being deposited.
Yeah, that's right.
Sort of standard.
Doing lots of transactions in amounts slightly below $10,000, for example. They will file with the Treasury, and in particular with our Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN, a Suspicious Activity Report, or SAR. And those are then used by law enforcement, and it's not just the Treasury, but law enforcement, whether it's FBI or the IRS or state and local law enforcement, to investigate potential crime.
So something that's actually lawful, though.
It can be, yeah. It can be. So we get lots of suspicious activity reports, and they can be law enforcement can look at those suspicious activity reports if they, for example, are chasing someone they know is engaged in, for example, some sort of illicit activity, and they're trying to figure out how they launder their money. They can come to FinCEN and use the database of suspicious activity reports we have to attempt to trace the financial network. And that's actually been works in all sorts of circumstances. The obvious and most prominent example of how this has worked is it was used. Those suspicious activity reports were used for tracing terrorist financing and attempting to determine who's connected to you have terrorist A, who's financier B, or terrorist financier B, and trying to trace those flows of information. And so the day-to-day of a AML lawyer is, there are a variety of different roles, but one of them would be to attempt to trace, using suspicious activity data, financial flows to attempt to determine, where is the money from, say, narco trafficking going? How do we root out not just the individual narco, the individual dealer in Dubuque, but the person who's bringing the money into, across the border, and the person who's, in Guadalajara or somewhere like that. And so there's a tracing aspect. We also spend a lot of time, frankly, advising financial institutions on their duties with regard to filing this information. And to your point, Jamil, earlier about regulation in this space, this is a space where financial institutions, it is a burden on financial institutions to have to file these things. Anybody who's worked in a bank knows that's true. It's a very substantial compliance burden for them. The secretary, my boss, will say, and has said publicly, that he, when he was a banker, he only saw the outflow of these suspicious activity reports. He didn't see the benefit of them. And now that he's secretary, and I'll say, I used to represent clients who filed these things and got investigated for, failing to file occasionally. And when you're inside the government and you see the benefit of the investigations that are made, the intelligence benefits that are gained, you realize that there's both a burden and a benefit. And we are working currently, and in fact, I'm meeting later today on this, we're working currently on finding ways to keep that system as effective as it is, or more effective for the governmental consumers of that data, while modernizing the way it works. And so, for example, and this goes back to our point about use cases and technology and things like that, there have to be benefits from AI and machine learning in analyzing patterns in financial data. There just have to be. It's impossible to imagine there aren't. And so, part of one thing that we did in the past year is we put out a statement, Treasury plus the banking regulators, who actually are the supervisors of the financial institutions who file this data, we put out a statement encouraging people to encouraging financial institutions to fulfill their obligations to file in innovative ways. So, working together on pattern recognition or things like that, because there have to be ways that we can do this that are more beneficial and take a benefit and that benefit from increased technology. And this is a regime that's been around for a very long time, and modernizing it clearly will have benefits both for the government in getting data that is more focused on risks that we're concerned about and better tailored to our needs, and less of the, more of the wheat and less of the chaff, if you will, more of the needles and less of the haystack, and yet is done in a way that increases the role of automation in the financial institutions that are filing.
Right. Back?
Similar type question, but a little bit different angle. Recently on FARA registration, for example, they have a new appointed.
FARA, you mean the Foreign Agent Registration Act?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And so they have a new appointed head who's going to tighten it up, in layman's language, in theory. And on this issue of malicious, not criminal, malicious, you have a lot of state actors who are very effective using this system, the greater system, to be malicious, whether it's election financing, other types of things that are nefarious, malicious, but not criminal. So your answer to this question kind of speaks to what I was getting at, which is a more fine-tuned, informative process that benefits government, our government, from those malicious actors. Any comments?
Yeah, so you're right that FARA is taking an increasing prominence. I think there's increasing enforcement of the provisions there, which
Well, there's some prominent examples of people ignoring
yeah,
it.
for better or worse, for a long time, we're not particularly aggressively enforced. On the specific reforms that you could see making use of that data, really outside my bailiwick, and so I don't really have an answer on that.
Right in the front, ma'am.
Yes, I have questions dealing with the foreign countries. Do you work closely with State Department or DOD in the issue of military? So my question is in the case of our nuclear technology, as China and Russia have either stealing or duplicate our hypersonic missiles, do we charge them, and how, Treasury Department or State Department or DOD charge them or sanction, or what kind of punishment that we give them?
Yes, when it comes to sensitive technologies, right? What's your relationship with state and DoD, and how does Treasury help protect sensitive technologies?
So there are a number of different things there. One of them is back to the point we were discussing about CFIUS, which is, and these are what would otherwise be legitimate transactions that present national security threats. We work very closely with state and DoD on those. When you look at a particular transaction, the question of whether the technology is or is not sensitive for example, our national security base is fundamentally one that is often within the expertise of the Defense Department. They have a big, sophisticated, very capable CFIUS operation within DoD to make those assessments. Our intelligence community also gets involved. Separately, there are the questions of what we would refer to as market distorting practices that other countries engage in. So, for example, theft of intellectual property. Similarly, we see with regard to China, we see forced technology transfers and forced joint ventures. On those, there is an effort to combat them both in real time with regard, with whether it's the CFIUS process or otherwise, and with cybersecurity efforts to protect that data. But there's also the trade talks we're engaged in with the Chinese, where one of the focuses is on these structural practices that we think are problematic and inconsistent with market activity and with the the international trade norms, where one of the things we're working on with the Chinese is ensuring that these market distorted practices are not harmful to the United States, and we were trying to, as part of our trade negotiations, address the Chinese use of those, and I think we're moving toward success.
We'll take one last question right there to the back, sir.
How does the CFIUS team identify acquisitions that potentially pose national security threats? Are you relying on self-reporting, or does your team go?
It's a great question. So I got to distinguish.
I feel like you planned that question.
I didn't, but
you're very excited about
we
it.
can talk later. I got $5 for you. So before the reform last year, we relied on self-reporting, although we had the ability to take a transaction that we spotted and bring it in ourselves by self-reporting it, if you will. And so,
But you weren't doing a lot of spotting, to be fair.
we did some spotting, but look, I mean, it's a big economy, and so we would occasionally bring in a transaction before, while it was in the formative stages, or even after it closed, and say this transaction is problematic. And in some cases, we could force an unwind.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Wow.
but FIRMA, the legislation reforming the CFIUS process, has the benefit of, with regard to a defined set of transactions, actually requiring mandatory declarations. Traditionally, a CFIUS filing is quite burdensome. It's actually very lucrative for the lawyers to put together one of these things. And these declarations...
Former national security law class.
Yeah. The declarations that are now mandatory for a certain, or will become mandatory when FIRMA becomes fully effective. There's an effective date that's still some months away. But when FIRMA becomes fully effective, people will be required to file declarations, which are basically like short form filings
As they dealt
for
their transactions.
transactions. Yeah, you're required to file by statute,
Yeah.
and so in that case, I think we'll get dramatically more filings, but many of them will be basically short form filings that we can look at and say, yeah, this one we want more information. This one, go on your merry way.
All right, well, thank you all. Thank you very much, Brent, for coming.
you.
And
Delighted to
join
be here.
me in thanking Brent Ackman.